Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and with an MSRP of just £209, the Philips Evnia 27M2N3501PA is easily the cheapest monitor I have reviewed all year. Despite that, it's still packing in an impressive spec sheet. We have a Fast IPS panel with a 1440p resolution, and that's clocked at 260Hz. The kicker though is that this monitor isn't actually retailing for £209. Despite that being the MSRP, it's actually on sale for just 150 quid right now here in the UK, and that price is set to last till the end of the month. Surely it's too good to be true. For those who aren't too familiar with the Philips Evnia lineup then, they currently have a range of monitors. We typically review models in the 8000 series, so those are more like the flagships, but obviously with the 27M2N3501PA being in the 3000 series, it is a decidedly entry-level screen. Now that does mean it won't have the same bells and whistles as a more expensive monitor, as there's no ambiglow lighting for instance, and the HDMI ports are of the 2.0 variety rather than 2.1. But what I'm really interested in today is whether or not the core gaming experience can be any good at the £150 asking price. So let's dive in and find out whether or not that is the case. We will kick things off though with a look at the design of the 27M2N3501PA, and it will be familiar to anyone who's seen our previous Evnia reviews, given the company does like this bright white aesthetic with some silver accents, and that extends right down to the V-shaped foot. Personally speaking, I have warmed to it over the last year or two. Safe to say it's not going to be for everyone, but it does definitely help this monitor stand out from the crowd of the usual all black monitors we are used to seeing. Just one thing to add here though is that while many of the Philips Evnia monitors we review do come with ambiglow lighting, that is missing from this screen here purely due to cost, but it's just something to keep in mind. It is great to see the included stand ticking all the boxes though. With 130mm of a height adjustment, you get 30 degrees of swivel in both directions, there's tilt from -5 to +20 degrees, and then full 90-degree pivot functionality so the display can be used vertically, and then VESA 100x100 mounts are also supported. It's when moving on to look at the connectivity options though where we see another clear area where corners have been cut to meet this very aggressive price point. We find just one DisplayPort 1.4 port and then two HDMI ports and a headphone jack. So that means no USB upstream, no Type-C charging or KVM functionality, while it's also important to note that the two HDMI ports are of the 2.0 variety, not HDMI 2.1, and that means at 1440p they are capped to just 144Hz, so you don't get the full 260Hz refresh rate with those HDMI ports, though of course you do get that from the DisplayPort. It is at least good to see that Evnia has included an OSD joystick rather than those fiddly 5-way button controls, and that is positioned on the back of the monitor in the bottom right hand corner. As for the OSD itself, it appears unchanged since we last looked at an Evnia screen. It's definitely not the prettiest UI going, but it does have a good number of features and it's easy to navigate using the joystick. My only real complaint, and I have said this before, is that there are no customizable shortcut options, so being able to quickly adjust brightness without diving into the main OSD itself is always a welcome feature to me, but that is sadly missing here. It's also worth quickly clarifying that to achieve the maximum 260Hz refresh rate, you do need to enable the overclock function from within the OSD, otherwise it defaults to 240Hz out of the box. I don't think it's going to make too much difference either way, but if you do get this monitor and you're wondering why it's stuck at 240, not 260Hz as advertised, that's why. Just lastly though, there is also the option to use Evnia Precision Center, which is a Windows-based software that allows you to adjust the monitor settings directly from your PC. It does seem absolutely fine in my usage, though it is occasionally a bit slow, but it is a nice to have extra feature. Leaving behind the design of the monitor though, it's now time to move on to talk about testing. Here we use Portrait Display's Kalman Ultimate software, and that is paired with the X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus colorimeter. If we kick things off then with brightness and contrast, we do see a solid range of brightness from 68.7 nits up to just below 400 nits, and that does exceed Evnia's claim of 300 nits typical. Black levels are also reasonably good for an IPS panel, resulting in contrast that's around 1160:1. Pretty typical for a modern IPS, but again, slightly higher than Evnia's 1000:1 claim. It is a very minor point, but the only other thing I'd say about the brightness is that the actual output luminance doesn't ramp up evenly. It does until you hit 75%, but then the measured brightness from there up to 100% clearly progresses at a much more aggressive rate, as you can see from this line graph. Now, does it really matter? Probably not, but users would get more control if the steps were even across the whole range, rather than having the last 25% ramp up so quickly. As for the gamut though, it's pretty wide considering the price of the monitor. It generally exceeds the sRGB space and then delivers 93.9% DCI-P3 coverage alongside 91.5% reporting for Adobe RGB and then 69.6% coverage for Rec 2020. Yes, we have seen wider gamuts overall, but is it really going to matter to the target audience considering it's a £150 gaming monitor? I personally don't think so. Despite that low price as well, the factory calibration of the 27M2N3501PA is really impressive. The colour balance, for instance, is very even and averages just 6619K, so very close to the 6500K target. Gamma has one small spike early on which results in some lost dark shadow detail, but otherwise it comes fairly close to the 2.2 target and averages 2.261. The proof is in the pudding though, as they say, and the average grayscale Delta E 2000 of just 1.01 really speaks for itself that this is indeed a very good factory calibration. The saturation results are also fine. There is some oversaturation given the monitor's gamma does exceed the sRGB space, but relative to DCI-P3, the average Delta E is 2 on the nose, so it is a good showing. The same also goes for colour accuracy. Relative to sRGB, we're looking at an average Delta E of 2.92, which is to be expected given the oversaturation, though this does improve to 2.11 relative to the DCI-P3 space. Thankfully, Evnia also provides an sRGB mode in the OSD, and this works pretty well. It clamps the gamut to prevent oversaturation while also delivering accurate grayscale, though gamma does get slightly too high towards the end of the curve. Both saturation and colour accuracy Delta E figures are much improved over stock though, making this mode well worth using if you do want to avoid oversaturation. Of course, for the best results we also ran a full calibration, and that led to stellar accuracy across the board. Now, I can't imagine too many people will be calibrating a £150 gaming monitor, but it does at least go to show what the panel is capable of if you have the right software and hardware tools. Other things to note though include that viewing angles aren't great by IPS standards, with a noticeable drop off in brightness when viewed from above, and that's perhaps indicative of the lower price point. There was very little backlight bleed on my unit though, and that is always good to see. Time to move on though and talk about response times, where we use the open source response time tool, and I've tested all 4 of the overdrive modes found within the OSD at 260Hz. Starting with overdrive turned off then, the 27M2N3501PA delivers results that actually aren't terrible. It's not fast by any means, but the average response time of 7.9 milliseconds without any overdrive would indicate a reasonably good panel. Enabling the fast overdrive mode though speeds things up to 6.22 milliseconds on average, while only one transition shows a small amount of overshoot. The faster mode is clearly the best though, with barely any overshoot across the board, while the average response time improves to 4.49 milliseconds. Now, there are still some slower transitions in the bottom left hand corner, indicating slower fall times from a full white image, and that results in 60% refresh rate compliance. It'd be more accurate to call this a 220Hz panel based on our testing, though it's safe to say that is a small marginal difference. Lastly, we tested the fastest mode, though this introduces a lot of overshoot, so as we typically find with these maxed out overdrive modes, it isn't worth using. Now, given the faster mode is clearly the best option, I also tried it at 120 and 60Hz to see if variable overdrive has been implemented. Sadly, it hasn't, given overshoot gets progressively worse as the refresh rate drops. That means you'll be better off using the fast mode if you're playing games at or below 120 FPS, whereas faster only makes sense above that figure. It's clearly not an ideal situation for adaptive sync gamers then, as you obviously don't want to be manually adjusting the overdrive mode frequently every time you switch game, but it's also probably to be expected considering the price of the monitor. Now, I also have a visual representation of these 3 overdrive modes thanks to the Blurbuster's UFO tool, and I have to say overall motion clarity is very solid using the faster mode. You can also see the overshoot that's brought on by the fastest mode too, so again, I would not recommend that one. Now, because I've not tested any screens that are this cheap for a long while, for comparisons then I've included the AOC U27G4R and the Iyama GCB3486WQ SCP. And those are both more on the affordable end of the spectrum, but they're closer to £300 than they are £200. Even then, the Philips Evnia comes out favourably. Motion clarity, as you can see, is pretty similar to the 320Hz mode on the AOC U27G4R, and it is clearly better than the VA panel that Yamaha is using, so that is really good to see considering the price. Evnia also includes a smart NBR sync mode, however, which is a backlight strobing mode that does work with adaptive sync. The good news is that this does not cap brightness, unlike some other screens, and it works reasonably well. For some reason it does default to the fastest overdrive mode, but you can manually change that in the OSD. There's just a small hint of signal crosstalk as well, resulting in a little bit of a double image effect, but it could still be worth using if you are looking for another boost to motion clarity. As for how all of that technical data then relates back to the real world gaming experience, I have to say it's a pretty fast and fluid experience that really belies the price tag. For starters, the 1440p resolution and 27-inch screen size is considered by many to be the modern day sweet spot, so you get a reasonably sharp experience without the monitor taking up your whole desk, plus the GPU demands required for pushing 1440p resolution are really pretty reasonable by modern standards. The high refresh rate coupled with the generally solid response times equates to a good experience for fast-paced games too. As mentioned, you will want to drive the frame rate at over 120 FPS to stick with the faster overdrive mode, but that was no problem for me in Call of Duty, and in easier to run games like Counter-Strike 2, you'll have absolutely no issues maxing out the refresh rate. I also tried a couple of the baked-in gaming features here too, like the sniper scope option if you want an easier way to get some sneaky headies, but before you call me out, I was only playing with bots. The screen is still a very good option for slower paced games though, possibly things more like AAA titles where you may struggle to get over 120 FPS. If that is the case, just drop back to the fast overdrive mode and you can still benefit from what is a reasonably wide gamut, giving a nice saturated appearance for those single player type games, and then contrast is also decent for a budget IPS, definitely better than the Asus XG27 UCS we reviewed recently, though if you do want really punchy contrast, VA could be the way to go, but that has other downsides too, including typically worse motion clarity, as we saw previously. There is more good news though, that of course adaptive sync is supported. Now it's not officially G-Sync certified, though we wouldn't expect that at this price, but it worked absolutely fine in my use case with no flickering or anything like that, so no worries there. Lastly, it's also good to see that lag is nice and low, averaging just 2.16 milliseconds, so that's barely more than half a frame at 260Hz, so it's really not a concern. That brings us on to the end of the review though, and the first thing to establish is, despite all of its positive points, the Philips Evnia 27M2N3501PA is not a perfect monitor. Clearly, corners have been cut to meet the aggressive price point, including the lack of any USB ports or modern connectivity options, while the two HDMI ports are limited to 144Hz at 1440p due to their 2.0 spec rather than being HDMI 2.1. The lack of variable overdrive also isn't ideal. There's no ambiglow lighting that we have become accustomed to on more expensive Evnia displays, while there's also a small gamma spike early on in the curve that does result in some lost dark shadow detail. However, and this is a resounding however, those negative points are easily overlooked when we consider both just how good this screen is for gaming and the fact it's currently retailing for just £150. It really is honestly quite a bargain to get a 1440p 260Hz display that offers this kind of speed along with the impressive factory calibration. Yes, our testing did suggest that the real world refresh rate is closer to 220Hz than it is 260Hz, but the difference is pretty marginal and our Blurbuster's UFO images speak for themselves. Motion clarity is very good indeed. On the topic of pricing though, we have based a lot of this review on the £150 price point, which is currently showing on OC UK and other UK retailers. Yes, this is a temporary deal, so pricing will go back up, but we confirmed with Evnia it's going to run for the rest of the month until 31st of October, and even at the £200 asking price, I still think this monitor is a bit of a bargain. Also, the fact that it is already going on sale at such a good price as this suggests to me that it will go on sale again in the future, so definitely worth keeping an eye out around Black Friday or possibly the Boxing Day sales if you do miss out on this month's promo. Whatever the case, it's really hard not to be impressed by the sheer bang for buck offered by the Philips Evnia 27M2N3501PA. Sure, as we said, it's not perfect, it's missing a few features and some other areas could be executed slightly better, but if you're in the market for a gaming monitor that offers a 1440p resolution, 260Hz refresh rate, and currently costs less than £200, well, look no further. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this review. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation as well, you can find a link to our Discord server down in the description, and while you're there, you'll also find links to both our merch store and our Patreon if you want to help us out that way. That's it for this one though guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.